Good evening. Welcome to another Gateway X clinic. Our next clinician is a lifelong rail fan and model railroad enthusiast. He's the editor of the White River Productions monthly model railroad news and HO Collector Quarterly, as well as an avid collector and enjoys hobby history. Welcome to Mr. Tony Cook.
Thanks, Gert. How are you guys doing this week? Another exciting week of shows.
Yes,
This has become an old hat for you, but it's such neat stuff.
we'll catch up on sleep next week.
That sounds like something Gordy would say. Awesome. Well, all right, I'll take her over here. I'm going to talk about 86-foot high cube boxcars. And I'll give the, let me get, there we go. As Gert said, I'm a lifelong railroad enthusiast and model railroad collector. Um, my dad worked for Walthers in the late 1960s. I grew up in central Illinois. That top right picture is me there in a black Chevy Corvair in my hometown of Jerseyville, Illinois. Seeing a GM&O freight, that's the kind of stuff I grew up with. Later on, my work included I was the marketing director for Union Station, Kansas City after it reopened, and helped establish our permanent model railroad museum that is being renovated right now. It has trains of all different scales, and that's in downtown Kansas City. And then, as of about 10 years ago, I've been the editor of Model Railroad News, a monthly publication produced by White River Productions. This is our August issue that's arriving now, and it is Rio Grande themed. We have all kinds of Rio Grande materials in this issue, including the new Coach Yard brass import Rio Grande steam generator car, which you see there on the cover. We also have in-scale GP30s in Rio Grande, the recent HO Walthers Mainline SD50 in Rio Grande, and the AccuRail HO Scale Denver and Salt Lake boxcar among our reviews. So lots of good stuff. That's monthly. You see our website at the bottom, modelrailroadnews.com. As Gert mentioned, I'm also the co-editor of HO Collector Quarterly. It is in its going into its fifth year. The latest edition is at the printers and just coming out now, and features operating hopper cars and those wonderful 62-foot triple dome tank cars. My co-editor Tony Lucio did both of those cover stories for this latest HO Collector. I also contribute to Railroad Model Craftsman, another White River publication. I do the collector consist that appears quarterly. My most recent one was in the June issue, which you see there, and it's on F units, some of the landmark F units done over the years. So that's a little information on me. As I said, we're going to talk about 86-foot high cube boxcars, which this obviously is not. But this was kind of the starting point for the research on how boxcars evolved. This is a Jerseyville and Eastern 40-foot boxcar, and as you can see, this is a very old style car, although steel, with rivet sides. It's kind of been rebuilt over the years, and you can see a couple of standard 40-foot boxcars on both sides of it, showing the height difference, although all these are plate B cars, so no excess height here. The 40-foot boxcar by the 1950s looked more like this. This is a Superior Door 40-foot, Boston and Maine. Pullman Standard and many other companies, as well as railroads themselves, built these cars, and it was just the standard, way that things were transported, and everything, and many things you wouldn't think of today, from grain, even coal in the older days, where they'd basically tack boards up across the door opening and fill the car with a commodity that you'd now think would go in some kind of hopper car. But the boxcar was it. That's how everything traveled at one time on railroads. Boxcars grew in size. This is a 50-foot Penn Central subsidiary Peoria and Eastern car. This again is still a standard, type of boxcar for general service, more or less. As you notice, there's no cushion coupler. It is an older style with friction trucks. It still has running boards on the roof, high brake wheel, and tall ladders. As boxcars and all freight cars got more specialized in the 1950s and into the 1960s, sizes got bigger, weights got bigger. We saw many new cars, covered hoppers, and other specialized things where we basically moved away from boxcars. And the goal on that was to protect shipments better, and to have a car that worked better than just what the standard boxcar was. So you got all sorts of things like air slide hoppers, the various covered hoppers and center flows, big auto racks to carry cars, and all of that starts to hit in the mid to late 1950s and into the 1960s. Now, this car is a mid 60s build, but this is typical of yet another jump for boxcars. This is the 60-foot or 62-ish foot car, and this is an early example that still has the running boards on its roof, still has tall ladders, tall brake wheel, but if you notice, it's got cushion couplers, so the extended coupler pockets, which helps to protect the load, and those were some of the things that started to come in to some of the more basic cars. As we move into the big high cubes, this was the biggest the boxcar ever got, and they show up in the early 1960s originally, and 86 feet. You hear them referenced sometimes as 85 foot, 86 foot. Again, that's a general thing. Just I'll stick with 86 foot, but know that there's probably a more exact measurement. Although to my knowledge, all of these are built basically to the same specification. 1963 is the debut for this car. Now, this I saw at the St. Louis RPM meet. I believe it was last year, 2019. This is a custom-built model. I believe it was at the Wabash Society booth, and unfortunately, I was not able to locate the person that built it. But I took a picture of it, and this is a prototype scheme, and this car is actually the Athearn Blue Box four-door. And when you say four-door, you say, well, I only see two. But in high cubes, the reference generally goes to both sides of the car. So this is a four-door car, meaning two insulated plug doors per side. American Car and Foundry built this first one in mid-1963. It was a project done in cooperation with three railroads, which you see there on the right side of the car, Louisville and Nashville, Southern Pacific and Wabash. And it was done for Ford. And you see Ford stamping cars, stamping car on its name. So Ford Motor Company was the client or the customer that the railroads were trying to better serve, and ACF joined in this project. These cars initially carried a lot of auto parts, and when you say auto parts, you're talking like fenders, hoods, things that are bulky and large, but not necessarily heavy in weight. Thus, you can go out to 86 feet and still have a car that's not too heavy to operate that or go past the 100-ton mark. So ACF builds this first car, and it's ACFX 101. But then, although American Car and Foundry was a major builder of freight cars, they don't stay with high cubes. They're not a builder when the cars go into regular production. The three major companies that built high cube boxcars, beginning at the same time in the early 1960s, were Greenville, Thrall, and Pullman Standard, with Greenville building the most cars. Greenville will be the one that I'll focus on with a lot in the prototype pictures. Greenville, sadly, has been largely omitted from a lot of model production. Now, the old Athearn Blue Box high cube boxcar is similar to a Greenville, although both styles of cars that Athearn released around 1970 in its HO Blue Box line both have some things about them that kind of don't pass as far as being exact towards a prototype, which is typical of a car of now going on 50 years old. But here's the four-door version of the Greenville car. And as far as spotting features go to looking for these cars, the fish belly type frame is a good spotting feature for the Greenville. And what I mean by that is jip in the side of the car, which carries the lower track of the plug doors. The Greenville is riveted side, and there are different phases to it, and we'll look at those. Here's the Thrall car, and again, it's like at a glance, like, well, isn't that the same? But if you notice, going in from the stirrup steps on the Thrall, there's no fish belly to it. There's a slight curve there right by the stirrup step, and then essentially a straight sill runs across the bottom. And the Thrall car has a welded side. If you notice, the vertical panels there don't have the bumps for rivets. So, and again, I'm talking in kind of generalities here, but as far as glancing at a picture and saying, oh, that's a Thrall, or oh, that's a Pullman Standard, my goal here is just to give you some things where you can quickly tell apart the three majors. So the Thrall car, generally mostly a straight sill, versus this fish belly type sill of the Greenville. Greenville, as you can see, the dots, the vertical dots there on the sides of rivets, the thrall car welded side. Then Pullman Standard also built high cubes. And by the way, as I'm mentioning these things, I must thank James Kincaid, who helped me with some pictures and information and drawings for this presentation. This is one of his pictures. This is a Pullman Standard builder's picture. And this is their four-door car. I think the Pullman Standards are the easiest to identify. It has welded sides, but you'll notice along the sill, it has a straight sill similar to Thrall, but you see the vertical posts are exposed across the bottom. That the smooth side to the car essentially ends at the lower part of the door. It matches up pretty much to those silver insulated plug doors. And each of those kind of sliver posts you see, they continue up on the car, that this exterior smooth side sheeting was put on them. But the Pullman cars basically show the lower tips of the exterior post. So that's how you can tell a Pullman. The other builder of some quantity was Southern Pacific's Cotton Belts and Santa Fe's Pacific Car and Foundry examples. These are really neat cars, but they are definitely, less common compared to the three major builders. This is an early picture of a PC&F car. As you can see, it's got a high brake wheel. It has running boards, and it is outside braced, which essentially the other cars would be too, but they're covered with panels across the side to give them a smooth look. These cars, again, I believe are exclusive to Santa Fe, had some. SP and its subsidiary Cotton Belt had some, and they did get modernized. I'll touch upon that here in a moment. But this car to date did not have the same production or popularity that the other three major builders had as far as quantities built. As I stated, these cars were really built on the line. They come out in 1963. 1966 is when the railroad rules changed on high brake wheels and rooftop running boards. Now, these cars were some of the first to kind of get, they got to drop the high brake wheel and ladders ahead of that 66 rule that came in. And that's where a lot of cars started getting modernized beginning in the second half of the 1960s, when running boards came off cars. And many railroads, many cars they dropped the brake wheel and the high ladders. So in a way, you're kind of familiar with seeing these cars as a very modern looking car. So it may seem odd, but there was a group of them built those first couple of years. And the Santa Fe car on the left shows that high ladder. The edge of the running boards is clearly seen there on the top. And then it's got a high brake wheel. So there are some cars that very much have an older appearance. Now, the SP car on the right is showing its A end, so not the brake wheel end. And as you can see, there's a little bit of like a cleat or a post there in the top center that it probably had running boards as well, and they'd already been stripped off. And the A end of these cars naturally would not have tall ladders on this side, as there would not be access to the top of the car. As I mentioned, Greenville built the most. Greenville was a major builder of freight cars. And as you can see here, this is an ad from Simmons Boardman's Railway Age magazine. And this shows covered hoppers. Basically everything here is a 100-ton-ish car of the early 1960s. And among them, you see Greenville showing its high cubes with the Erie, Lackawanna, Southern, and Penn Central cars in the center of the image. The Greenville car in its phase 1 style is shown here. As you can see, there's no actual ladder on this car. Those are grab irons running up the side to reach the running boards. This Pennsylvania car is an early example of Greenville's. Again, look at the fish belly frame and the rivets. There's a row of rivets running along the sill, and then vertical rivets for the panels. This style too, if you notice, out on the edges where the grab irons are going up, before you get to the area that's been paneled over for the exterior post, you notice it stands out a little bit. And there's kind of a recessed or indented area back there along the stirrup step and up those grab irons on the side. Now, Greenville's production will change, and I'll show you another version of their car where this area is not as wide as it is there. But this is a neat picture of an early example of this car that would be 1963-64 production. That this would be the as delivered look with access to the roof, running boards up top, and tall brake wheel. These cars hung around forever, and as was done with many other cars, they got modernized. This Western Pacific car, and wanted to take a minute here to also mention these cars for modelers and collectors have some of the neatest paint schemes that, because of the big sides and the large billboard lettering, even a fairly plain car like this boxcar red Western Pacific is neat with the distribution dividend with the arrows logo on the left side, that all of them are such awesome looking cars. This Greenville is an early phase, this is a phase one and would have been an early car on Western Pacific's roster, but you can see it's been modernized. They torched off the grab irons going up to the top. You see the black dots there would be where they cut the grab irons off on the right side of the car. The running boards are gone, but that small like poster cleat is still up there in the top center in the white excess height panel. And then the brake wheel has been moved down, and you can see some markings on the end of the car showing where that was changed. So again, they didn't have this look for long, that as everything was modernized, so were these cars. So many of them you'll see give evidence that this was an early car that had that more traditional look of tall ladders, brake wheel, and running boards, but they changed quickly in service. And coupled to it is a DT&I car on the left that's in the same situation, that it was modernized. Here's another phase of Greenville production. This is another builder's photo that was shared with me by James Kincaid. This is a Frisco car. It would have been yellow with silver doors. And again, Greenville, the fish belly side and the rivets. Now you'll notice on this one, however, that indented area where the grab irons go is almost no wider than the grab irons themselves. And this version of car, to my knowledge, is always built modern. There was no older with roof walks and tall grab irons and brake wheel. That this style comes a few years later, and again has the recessed pattern or sides is much smaller. Greenville also built 8 doors. All 3 of the majors built both 4 doors and 8 doors. It's a little tougher to tell, but again, there's, as you can see coming in from the stirrup step, there's a bit of a fish belly side. On the other builders, it is more of just a straight drop, and it's closer to the stirrup step. This is Greenville's 8-door car. All of these cars basically carry the white excess height warning. That's the white panel or white section along the top and the ends of the car. You see it, and it says no running board in excess height. The white band basically at the bottom of it would be the height of a regular box car. The information that I've always heard, and I think is fairly correct, is 4-door cars often worked Ford plants, and these 8-door cars work General Motors plants. But again, I don't know that for a fact, and I've heard some conflicting information at times of yes and no, but I think that's a general thing that you can go by. This is a B&O car that would have been repainted in the 1970s into chassis system paint. And again, it's an example of Greenville's 8-door car. Thrall was the next major builder, or the next largest builder of high-cube boxcars. Here's an example of a Thrall 4-door, and as you can see, the sill is fairly straight, and that you don't have the same, it's a welded sidecar, so there's not the rivet pattern that's apparent on the Greenville. And again, on all these, there's some phase differences, and a few of them got rebuilt in the later 80s and into the 1990s, which can change their look as well. And again, a note on the paint schemes, you know, this awesome Indian red Santa Fe with the big super shock control, and most of them had silver doors, the white ends. These cars really stood out in trains and were always so awesome to see. But this, I believe, is a Thrall 4-door car, and here's Thrall's 8-door car. And again, it's very similar in a way to Greenville's, but it has a more, less of that angled edge to its lower sill. As these cars matured and got older, the 8-door cars in general were in much less quantity originally. That as far as all three of the major builders go, they generally built 4-door cars for the most part. In fact, I think the Greenville breakdown works to almost 8 or 9 out of 10 were 4-door that Greenville built out of its total production. And I think that also transfers to Pullman Standard and Thrall. So in general, the 4-door car, not this 8-door car, is the common one. As they did hang around, they went into other service. They serve things like food. I know that Chicago Northwestern has some cars marked with XL service that did like breakfast cereal plants to carry things like that. Union Pacific and some others, and again, I'm talking 4-door cars serve like paper products that they survived, but I don't know that 8-door cars really had the same longevity and are still around. You still see 4-door cars today, but I can't tell you the last time I've seen an 8-door car. I don't think they're still around. The minority builder of the major three was Pullman Standard. This again is another ad from Railway Age magazine and comes to us from Simmons Boardman Publications. You see here, these are HO models, I believe, and show a collection of boxcars, including the little green car. In the foreground is the offshoot of the High Cube. That's the 40-foot baby High Cube, which came out in the late 1960s and was available as a sliding door car. There's also an insulated plug door and an outside brace car, and they were built by a number of companies. And these smaller cars generally carried appliances and not auto parts, but they were called a baby High Cube, and they were babies in reference to the larger 86-foot cars, which is that purplish car in the background there. A 4-door example of it is shown. And it, by the way, I think that's the Athearn HO car, which is closer to a Greenville car. So in Pullman's ad, they actually show what would be more of a Greenville car, but I guess they weren't rivet counters as whoever was putting that together for them. The Pullman car, here it is as a Frisco car, another sharp paint scheme. And as I noted, the way to tell the Pullmans, they really stand out among the other cars because they show the lower edges of their exterior posts. This is I think this is about a 1980 picture. You can see the stacked cot stencil on the right side, the black white outline that shows like the lube information and when the car was serviced. This also has the yellow dot, that black square with the yellow dot in the lower right corner, shows that its wheels were checked. That was an issue in the late 1970s with some wheel problems, and cars had to be checked for interchange. If it had a yellow dot, the wheels checked out and it was good for interchange. If that dot is white, the wheels had to stay on the home road and could not be interchanged. One thing to note here on the Pullman Standards, you'll notice there's really not a recessed area, that the ladders on both ends sit in a recessed area, but it's just a notch. If you see above the ladders, we go back to that, that exterior smooth surface comes across there. So another spotting feature on Pullman Standards High Cubes is the fact that the ladders sit in an indentation, but there's not a recessed area on the ends, as you'll find on the Greenville and Thrall cars. This is an example of an 8-door Pullman Standard, and again, this is a great shot. This is one I found on the internet. So is the Frisco, and again, it shows the exterior posts protruding there at the bottom. This is a Conrail quality scheme, which would put it in the probably late 80s. And also, these cars are, you see, the exceeds plate F, which is height and width of the car. So plate B is like a 40-foot box car, but as you get out to bigger cars, longer, wider, that the standards go, the warning basically saying plate F, so would not be able to go everywhere on every railroad. We'll take a look at the numbers here. The cars, as I mentioned, start in the early 1960s, 1963 with that ACF car, and production continued into the late 1970s. However, by the early 1970s, I believe after 1974, Greenville is the only builder for 86-foot High Cubes, that after 74, Thrall and Pullman Standard were out of the game. This shows you, and these are general approximate numbers. I think the Greenville number I've seen is actually 4,809, but I rounded it up to 5,000. And then the information I've seen is Thrall built about 1,000 less than Greenville, so that would put them around 4,000, and that Pullman Standard's output was about half of Greenville's, or 2,500. I don't have figures on the Pacific Car and Foundry, and there's also a few other odd cars, Whitehead and Kales, that built the superstructure for early auto racks, built at least one prototype car similar to how ACF built one car for the Hi-Cube design. But again, if you're looking at them in general, there's three to look for. These are the three companies, and those are the production numbers on Hi-Cubes. As I mentioned, they did hang around, and they did see some revisions. This is a later phase car. You see those notches around the center of the trucks are jacking pads, which is added to some of the later cars. This is a Western Pacific car, repainted in Union Pacific, but still carrying its Western Pacific reporting marks. These cars are still around quite a bit today. I do see them from time to time in Kansas City, in trains, over in central Illinois when I visit my family. My dad and I have chased trains on the Kansas City Southern that will have 2 or 3 of these cars. They're usually like CP or CN with just reporting marks on the side. And our information is they're carrying appliances built in Mexico, home appliances like refrigerators being brought up to the U.S. And I will apologize if you hear my dog barking. He was taking a nap, but and although he was told he had to be good for this presentation, it looks like we're having some issues. But so anyway, I apologize for the barking. Resources on these cars, I highly recommend picking up Mainline Modelers January 2004 and February 2004 editions. James Kincaid does this 2-part series that covers the Greenville 86-foot Hi-Cubes. There's scale drawings, there's complete roster information. It does focus mainly on the 4-door cars, but 8-door cars are listed in the roster as well. James goes through the different phases and gives a lot of good information on them. And in 2003, I believe he did a similar run on the Pullman Standard cars. David Kasdorf's 86-foot boxcars, as you see there on the left side, that kind of maroon cover, boxcar red covered book, you can find that as well. I believe David has a website, and you'll also find that on Amazon available. It's a paperback book and is roster information, although it does have many black and white pictures. And it was done, as you see there, it says 2012. And what he does is go through and find what cars are still in service today or then, and references them to like when they were built and the prototypes that they represent. We're going to move on to models, and I'm going to focus mainly on the HO cars just due to a time constraint, but I will also note some of the N-scale cars. The first plastic model to arrive came in 1970. This is a Railroad Model Craftsman ad that Athearn ran. The Hi-Cubes came out at the same time that the Alco PAs arrived for Athearn's line. The 4-door and 8-door Hi-Cubes came out at the same time. As you see there at the bottom part of the ad, Athearn's 86-foot twin monsters, as they called them. They were blue box kits and sold for $4.98. Here is that 4-door car, and as I mentioned, it at a glance, it very much is a Greenville car because of the fish belly frame, although you'll see it's the right side there stamped Thrall, which again is typical of this time. This is actually a later production. I think this might be a 90s car after the company was sold following Irv Athearn's passing away in 1991. But in general, the cars got lettered several different things. So that Thrall logo sits below the COT stencil, and the number and such, it probably does represent a Thrall prototype, but the model itself is a Greenville-ish car. I think where this car comes up short, well, I've got the picture here. Oh, I don't. There, I have it there. I guess I didn't get the bigger picture. Sorry. The car comes up short in that it has welded sides. The side vertical panels, there is the rivet line across the sill, but the vertical panels show welded when they should be riveted. So for its day, it's really a fairly respectable attempt and pretty close to a Greenville car. Everything is molded on it, as was typical of the blue box era cars. The only separate part is a brake wheel, goes on the one end. The other car that Ather did, the 8-door, is a bit more of a mix. In general, I think its sides and its look is suggestive of Thrall, but it shows those lower edges of the exterior posts similar to Pullman Standard, but doesn't quite show enough of them. You can see the posts running along beneath the doors and along the bottom. So in a way, it's a Pullman Standard. In a way, it's a Thrall. I suppose if you wanted to try to make it something, you could probably try to cut or get rid of those small exterior post tips that are showing and try to turn it into a Thrall car if you wanted to. But again, this, it's maybe a little less close to anything. And again, both these cars came out at the same time around 1970. Also in the late 1960s to around 1970, the first brass model of an 86-foot high cube came out. Trains Incorporated imported it from Japan, and later it was available from LMB, a distributor in the East. Again, this looks like a Greenville 4-door car. The car came without trucks. I believe those are roundhouse trucks I put on it for this picture. But the Trains Incorporated car just comes in a white box with, it's got the underframe and posts ready to accept couplers and trucks, but it came without them. I forget, I think this car retailed for around $20 back in 1970, and they're fairly available. You see them pop up on eBay. And if you're a collector of models, a big brass high cube is pretty cool. This one is in fair shape. As you can see, it's got some damage and things to the side. I've really done nothing with it after I picked it up, but it is a very neat car. Again, this dates to around 1970. It was in the initial group of Trains Incorporated imports, and then LMB imported it again in the 1970s. I believe they may have also done an 8-door import as well of a high cube. The first really serious quality plastic reproduction came from Walthers and dates to around 2000. There's many versions of this car. So if you're out there looking for them, be aware that one release is not all the same. They were in Walthers regular line, they were in the gold line, and then they went to the proto line. These examples here are not proto, but this shows both versions. Walthers did the Pullman Standard cars, and they did a very good job, of representing them. Things are mostly molded on. The door runners and rails and such, are part of the shell. The ladders in the indented areas on the ends are separate, and then they do have a separate crossover platform on the end, the gray molded piece, which is solid plastic on the early examples. But these were the first kind of serious, good 86-foot high cubes on the market. They did both Pullman Standards 4 and 8-door. And the cars did go through some changes, as I mentioned. Here's two. This is the 8-door Grand Trunk. And then this is as I mentioned, Northwestern, some of the Survivors see says food service only with the black XF on the side. That car, the yellow car on the right here, is the last release. And this is a Walthers Proto Edition. And it has a little better underframe detail. And then as you can see, it has an open etched metal crossover platform. You can see through it versus the solid plastic on the left there for the Grand Trunk. Now, when they did upgrade this to the Proto line, I believe only 4 doors were done, and mostly done in more modern schemes like this late Northwestern. So if you're looking for some of the earlier schemes, the older style is the only way you can get those. If you're trying to tell them apart, the very first runs just say Walthers Ready to Roll, and they have plastic wheels, and I believe they have Bachmann plastic whisker easy made couplers. When the car moved to the gold line, it got metal wheels and it got different knuckle couplers, which the Grand Trunk there, I believe, is that next the gold line. And then for Proto, it gets the Proto Max metal couplers, as I mentioned, enhanced underframe detail, the see-through etched crossover platforms, make it a proto car. And these have not been run in, I think it's going on almost at least 6 to 8 years that since that four-door run of proto cars was done, and it I believe is the only time they were done as proto. I said I'd mention N-Scale briefly. The N-Scalers got a car that HO never got. This is a Roco-produced 86-foot high cube that follows the PC and F car, and they even did it as the early version with running boards and tall ladders. This car, I think, was in the Minitrix line. It was also sold by Atlas. There's also two versions of a Greenville-ish car, four-door and eight-door, that's sold, I believe, from Atlas or Minitrix. Then they were later Rapido, and later Walthers and Concord, I think, sold both of those. Those you can find in a couple of different versions. And then fantastic high cubes are available today from Bluford shops. They do the Pullman Standard 4 and 8-door and N-Scale, and I believe Trainworks may have a high cube as well. So N-Scale is well covered there now. And if you need a mantelpiece, man, I can't tell you enough about the Lionel car. I got the Wabash version with it's a dark blue with the big Wabash flag on the side. I bought one for myself and then bought one for my dad because I thought they were so neat. But this is a scale 1/48th reproduction that Lionel did. It does have, I think you can convert it to scale couplers and such. I don't operate or do much with those scales, so this was just a car that I wanted to get because it was a really awesome big box car. But you'll find Lionel makes, and I think they also do the 8-door car. But if you're into freight cars and stuff, this is a car to look for to have one in your collection because they are pretty awesome. We're going to wrap up there. That gives you some information on the high cubes. Right now, this edition of HO Collector is hitting newsstands. I got my printer copy of it in the last couple of days. So if you're a subscriber, they should be arriving in the mail and arriving newsstands and hobby shops as well. Ahead later this year in the fourth quarter HO Collector, we will be doing Tyco's Virginian models with their train sets and the variations on the C430. And just a reminder to stop by shop.whiteriverproductions.com to find out more about all our books and our ever-growing line of magazines. Rail Pace News Magazine is now a member of the White River family. So stop by and you can subscribe, buy individual issues, and see our books as well by going to shop.whiteriverproductions.com. And that wraps up my presentation on these cars. I hope that it was some neat information. They're really awesome cars that I guess the interesting thing is for the models that have been done over the years, the most popular one, the largest production, the Greenville, doesn't exist as a good plastic model. So there's certainly, cars that we'd like to see come out that Walthers makes a good version of the Pullman Standard, but that Greenville is certainly needed, and that Pacific Car and Foundry, the exterior post for SB and Santa Fe fans, would be an awesome car to see show up as well.
Is there demand for these cars?
I think so. I think it's one of those, at first you can say, they're such long cars that, that they'd be prohibitive for, a lot of guys operating on tight radius curves. But same as passenger cars and piggyback flat cars and the auto carriers, I think even guys that maybe can't, run them that well because they've got tighter curves, still like to have them because, again, they're just awesome cars because they're so big. Now, the Walthers cars will turn on 24 radius, and they did have a nice coupler mechanism, and the old Athearn cars have a long swinging coupler that would probably maybe even get you around to 22.
Wow. So we have one question here, and I'm not sure if it's a trick question, but since they would be sent to separate Ford or GM plants in the 1970s, would you see only 4 or 8-door cars in a cut?
And see, that's one of the things I'm still looking into. It's my understanding that in a lot of them, there was like the Ford Fast Freight that operated on like Rock Island, Mopac, Rio Grande, Western Pacific from Detroit to the West Coast to a manufacturing plant for Ford. And there was also a GM train as well. So I would think if you see pictures on some of these trains, I think you'll find that yes, like the Ford Fast Freight probably always had four-door cars. And then GM trains would have had the eight-door cars. But I don't know that for an absolute fact. I do know if you look above the the road number and reporting marks, you'll see initials on many of the cars, and that relates to what plant they interchange to. So they were in a captive service in general, same as the baby high cubes basically all ran out of, like, I think it was Kentucky or someplace that built appliances. So they might go all over the place, but they all had to come back to the same source because that's where they were loaded. So I think that's correct, that four-door is Ford, eight-door is General Motors, and I've never heard reference to Chrysler. I don't know how that worked, and for that matter, American Motors in Wisconsin. I don't know if they, participated or used these cars either.
Someone else noted that first, thank you for all the detailed info. He saw the KD stick out due to a minimum radius problem.
Oh, no, what was that again?
You said, I see the KD stick out due to a minimum radius problem.
Or just a hard startup or stop to help protect the things inside the car that would shift back and forth. So the cushion coupler, which is helpful for model railroading too, gives them that little extra length. And you'll find cushion stuff on, everything from a lot of the late Santa Fe cabooses got cushion couplers for an improved ride to boxcars of 40, 50, 60 foot. Anything with that arm sticking out is probably a cushion car. And all the high cubes are cushioned to my knowledge.
Do you have any G-scale examples?
I don't know if G-scale has one. It might, and boy, if there is now, I got to find out and have one. But I don't know about an 86. I'll have to look.
Would you know if a lot of people scratch built these?
There was a Quality Craft model available in the 60s that was wood with cast metal ends that you could build. I think it's Planchot Pullman standard car. So there was that wood kit. And again, with the Atherns being available from about 1970 on, and the cars only date from 64, I think HO for sure and N-Scale had a number of cars by the late 60s. We always had, if they weren't perfect, at least ready-made starting points. As I mentioned on the Atherns, there's certain things you do to correct them, and you could carve off, the grab irons, cut off the stirrup steps and make them more scale. So I've seen a lot of attempts, because these cars were available for so long as basic models before the Walthers came along around 2000, that a lot of guys worked on these cars to make, something that looked really awesome and custom paint it.
Pretty cool. So that's the end of the questions I have here. Since our wheel is broken, something to do with sandpaper and cricket, which we Americans might not know anything about, how about you give the audience a question that they could answer in the chat for us?
A question. Name a major railroad that didn't own the high cubes. A lot of railroads had them, but what's a big road that didn't have them?
Welcome. You got speed at the bottom. Wait, I got out of the helix. Woo! Tonight we have the superintendent of the South Red River Valley Division in the Thousand Lakes region, U.S. Army retired, Mr. Matt Lenz.
Good
Matt, take it
evening.
away.
All right. Well, I got something for you that is my favorite thing to do. The Athearn Blue Box rebuild. So let's take a look. We're just going to go right into it. Let's take a look at the workbench. And right off the bat, I'll do spotlight. Okay. Let's go. Let's see if you can see. Okay. All righty. Classic Athearn Blue Box SD9. Early Athearn Blue Box GP9. Interim era Blue Box U30C. All right, are we frozen or you guys hear me?
No, we can hear you. Keep going.
Okay, all right. So, what I got for you, we're going to take these three apart. Then I've got an SD45 over here we're going to put back together. I've got sort of pre-staged for you. And we're going to put a new motor in it. We're going to put a special motor in it. First, let me talk about the eras and why I call it. This is what's called an early. You can see that here. See, no flywheels. Gray jet motor. And this one is really, really early. Because it has, if you can see this, let me get my pointer here. If you can see this, it's got a two-piece worm cover housing. So that makes this one pretty old. And it's got the metal side frames. Then we've got the SD9, still with the gray motor. This one's got steel flywheels, metal side frames, classic clip, just the same setup as they've always used. And this one has a cover over the gearbox on the bottom. Then we get what we call interim. Actually, this would be a post-1984 version. What you're going to need to do is ask Tony Cook these questions about these classifications. But this has plastic side frames. It's got the one-piece worm housing. It's got the gold motor. And it's got the brass flywheels. All right. We're going to break these down. I'm going to show you first what we're going to turn them into. Let's see if you guys can see that right there. This is metal side frame, U30C, two-piece worm housing cover. It's been remotored with a rare earth magnet 24-volt motor. Let's take a look how it runs. You aren't going to be able to hear it because it doesn't really make any sound. Just barely. So what I've done is I've removed the old motor, everything, and I've rewired it, cleaned it all up, and brought it up to modern standard. And by modern standard, I mean this is pretty modern. To do that, I needed a strong motor that was easy to mount levelly across these drive shafts. And I needed to make some custom universal joints. So I designed some in my 3D printer. And you can see that. I just made a whole bunch of them. I made enough. Now that I've designed them, I can make them whenever I want. And I made a custom motor mount. And I have some certain techniques that I use that generally, well, I don't know anybody else who does it. But when you get a remoter kit, usually it comes with some sticky tape and possibly couplings and U-joints and drive shafts to install a different motor. And not necessarily a newer or better motor, but it will be a different motor. I'm going to show you what makes these motors special. These are the last 6 I got. They're out of date now. Can't get them anymore because they're 4 years old. But these motors are rare earth magnet motors. That means they can do that. And they tend to snap together. But why would we want to do that? Well, here's one of the problems we have with motors, especially in DCC. Problem you have with a motor is you've got the motor. If for some reason the shaft cannot move, the motor will start to draw high power. It'll draw amps. And the amount of amps it'll draw can exceed the capacity of your decoder, the safe operating amperage that it can handle, and it'll blow it out, and then you're out the cost of a decoder. Or worse, you have a stall somewhere, and you've probably seen, melted rails, melted wheels, melted parts. It even cause a fire, some things like that. Well, we don't want that. So this type of motor is a super strong rare earth magnet motor, and these U-joints that I made here, they're made out of PLA on the 3D printer. So literally they cost nothing. All these motors together, all these parts that are yellow here, all together, didn't even add up to a penny. What happens is, if this motor were to, for some reason, encounter something that would stop the truck and make the motor tend to stall, this motor here will literally tear this piece off. It'll just rip it apart and then keep running. And that's a nice safety feature to have. The other nice thing about this is at about 7 or 8 volts, you can't pinch it with your fingers and stall it. Screwdriver motor. It's too strong for that. Your fingers cannot stop this motor even at half volts. But like I said, this motor's already out of date. It's 4 years old. That's ancient technology. Last ones I got, don't ask me where I got them because you can't get them anymore. And there's a reason. They've got better motors. And I have some to demonstrate. And why we would want to be messing around with these old Athearn blue boxes. Because by learning the skill necessary to take this from 1960s technology to something today, improving the pickup and everything, that allows us to do something like this. This is an Alco Models DL600B RSD15 RAS locomotive. Happens to be the one I'm going to paint on Thursday night. The skills that you get from rebuilding old Athearn locomotives, you can use to rebuild. Same principles apply. It just takes more practice and more. You need to put more thought into it. This For a brass locomotive, that's pretty darn quiet. That locomotive had motor here normally draws about 1.5 amps, and that's a lot. These motors, under normal operations, they rarely exceed 3/4 of an amp, rarely. But being out of date, moving on to something new, got this. This is the thing. Why we spend time rebuilding old Atherns? Because there it is, a dual motor, DD40, 2 brand new Mabuchi 24-volt high sensitivity motors. Same thing. They can rip apart the U-joints if they were to stall. At 24 volts, under complete stall, not this wheel slipping stall, but total stall is 2.3 amps. However, we're only running 14 volts. A complete stall of this motor at about 14, 15 volts is roughly 1.5 amps. However, you're not going to be able to stall it because at 4% power, with something like 0.5 volt, we're moving. We are not even up to 1 volt yet, and we're moving. Right there, that is 15% power. Nice and smooth. And that's what we like to have. We want to protect our work. Something has a little safety built in it. This new motor that I got, these are 6-pole motors, brand new. They're amazing. They're unbelievable. This motor, also brand new, is, I haven't found anything to put it in yet. You cannot pinch this at 0.5 volt. You cannot pinch it with your fingers and stop it. It's that strong. But unlike these, this won't even attach hardly at all to a small bolt. And it's way more sensitive. Motors change fast. Nowadays, motor technology changes as fast as cell phone. All right. So to get to this level, where you can put these things in anywhere you want to, let's go over the basics and break some down. So what we want to do, we're going to take apart the old GP9 here. Pick these up at train shows, under $20. This one here was probably more like 10. It has since it has the split cover, inside this split cover is the worm and the thrust washer. So let's try to keep those together. All these parts here got to go into the cleaner. So what we're going to do is we're going to set them on a towel behind me. I'm just going to start throwing the parts there. Later, I'll put them in a basket, put them in the ultrasonic cleaner. Okay, now that I've got the worm housing off, and it's almost like breaking off all the universal joints. Start breaking them off, pull the spring clip, discard it, take the trucks out. You can tell this is old by the way this is, and the low profile, that very low profile truck right there. But there ain't nothing wrong with this. The other thing that tells you that it's old is it has this cover. You want to be somewhat careful with these so you don't bust off tips of them. Once you get that off, it comes apart, and it has these inner sleeves, and the gears fit inside there. All that's going to go in the ultrasonic. One we're going to put back together has the same wheel set. We're going to take apart one that has the other wheel set. This one's got the little nubs on it, the ends of the axles. That's where you get your power. And I'm going to. There's our frame. Not much has changed, at least in blue boxes. Nowadays, they're not quite like this. Copper winding. I actually have this one set up so that it does not draw power from the frame. We'll get to that in a minute. That go in the bin of spare motors. All right, that takes care of the GP9. Move on to one that's just a little bit more modern, the SD9. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the headlight bracket because I'm never going to use it again. Take the spring clip. It's got a bunch of flash rust on it. Just like before, I'm going to pry from the side. I'm going to give it a twist. Now, when I lift the worm out, on the end here is a phosphor bronze bearing. Under that bearing is a thrust washer. Now I can break off the U-joints. This one is so bad that they're crumbling. We're going to talk about why that happens in just a minute here since we get this apart. Same thing, other side. This thing is literally encrusted with old grease. Truck's out. Same thing again. This thing, it's hard. We're just going to break it off. Again, just punch it out. Okay, we're not going to recycle the motor. Trucks we are going to use in these covers. And I'm actually going to, for purpose of demonstration, I'm going to use these right here. All right, frame, good to go. What we will need to do, we're going to mount couplers to this frame, and I always frame mount. I'm going to need to take a little bit off of this pad. You can see this, if you could see up close, there are basically two levels to this pad. Bottom pad, the big pad, you can shave that in half. You can use a mill file. I have a milling machine, that's what I use. Shave it in half. It will allow you to tap this hole, or drill this hole, then tap it, and you'll be able to screw in couplers. Put that aside. Now, I've got a couple things here I'm going to show you. Okay, all of this dry rotting. Now, I've got over here some motor mounts that aren't dry rotted. In fact, they're still nice and spongy. And in fact, I've got a lot of them here that are like that, and they're old. One of the things that happens when these locomotives, you break them down, right? The shafts. When you go to rebuild these, there are endless amounts of articles written over the years, tips and techniques and things that people have used. And one of the problems is, in the past, here, before I tell you that, if you could see this, and this is one of mine I got in the 90s. Back then, I used to super glue number 7 KD couplers onto these frames because it was easy. And if I want to change my mind, just break them off. Okay. Here is a motor mount. Look at that. So I'm guessing that what we're going to find right here, I don't know. We're going to see what I did. But I will tell you what happened. So I got a couple of these. And the first thing you used to do was hardwire it. Right? You take out the spring clip. You would attach wire, red wire, to the top of the motor from your 2 trucks. That's just what you did. You didn't see, obviously I didn't worry about the bottom. It still has the 2 little, the 2 wipers on it that wipe against this little machine spot in the bottom of the frame. But conventional wisdom at the time was to use Teflon, and still to this day, people are using Teflon lubrication. I think that's a bad idea, and it is my experience in taking these apart. I've got almost 300 of them, all used, all have scored train shows. And when I find the inside, I'm going to find out what this inside looks like. I'm going to give you a tip. To take this bottom piece off, do not pry it from the end. Go in from the side, push down with your small screwdriver, and it'll come right off without breaking. Now let's see if this is one of those that I used the Teflon on, or did I use the good stuff? This locomotive and its mate were in storage, not climate-controlled storage. So they were subjected to almost 2 decades of winters where the ambient temperature could be -20 for weeks at a time. What do we got here? This is what we've got. I did use the good stuff in here, and just like all the previous ones I've opened, I got no hardened oil. I've got no amber. And because of that, these gears actually look like they're in really good shape. And these wheels actually look like they're in really good shape. So I discovered that using Teflon grease, I mean, you don't know when all your trains, what if you're moving or something, if they're going to be in storage for a while, you do not want that Teflon grease in there. At extreme temperatures of summer and winter, that stuff will start to turn, or it will turn against your parts. It just happens all the time when I open them up. That's the way it is. But I discovered way back then, I use red lithium, high temp bearing grease. One can last you a long time. It's about 15 bucks right now. But at extreme temperatures, it stays good, does not attack plastic at all. In fact, it doesn't spread. It stays only where you put it. All right, now that I got all my parts, they all got to go into the cleaner. They've all got to be cleaned before I put it back together, because I'm going to do some things now that I know now that I did not know then. As you can see, these wheel sets are the ones with the phosphor bronze bearing. That needs to turn freely. When you see phosphor bronze bearing, against steel wheel, which these are, that should indicate that you need a drop of machine oil there. You need actual real machine oil. Okay? Simple lubricating oil. Just a pinhead's worth. That's all it takes to keep them in good operating condition. These side frames, here's another thing. The wrong lubricant will get in here from these holes here, where this thing goes in here. How many of you have done this and broken one of these pins off from brittle plastic? This here is at least 30 years old, and I'm not finding a bunch of brittle plastic on this. That's a good sign. That means what we did has proven itself over 3 decades that it works. And it works really, really well. The red lithium grease, it's not conductive, it's not reactive, and it is not affected by temperatures. It's not affected by any of that. Now we've got our parts. When they come out of the cleaner, we'll start to reassemble. But I already got some ready for you. Now what I want to show you, there was a product that I loved. I don't know if it was hazardous or whatever, but you can't buy it in a spray can anymore. And the farm store doesn't carry it at all. And I have it sprayed on here. You can see it kind of I don't know if you can see enough detail to see. There's a film over this. That film is graphite. And as you can see, it's covering the hole where the power comes from the black rail to the frame. It's over that hole. In fact, I bet what it does, it was called slip plate, and it was a conductive graphite. It was a really neat product, and it's totally stopped corrosion. Caused them to flash rust in a couple of hours. Caused them to rust all the way down in there. It'll cause these the metal insides of this, which I want to show you here. So I coated this with the conductive graphite, and it kept it from rusting. That was a good product. I wish we had that product again, but we don't. And fortunately, we got something better. If we can get this sucker back together. This is SD45. We're going to take these trucks that I have prepared. Now I've got some nice clean parts for this, but for now, I'm just going to recycle these two right here, more or nothing. The reason I'm showing you this one and not the one with the square bearings in it, the ones with the square bearings in it are not nearly as common at train shows as these are. And getting into when you go after an Athearn Blue Box, only to find out that what the heck is with this these trucks that fit into these round holes in here, and why do they derail all the time? They are notorious, especially the SDP40 and the SD45 that have these trucks, are notoriously difficult to keep on the track. That's why I want to show you this, because it's likely that many of you either have them and don't run them, or you see them at a train show and you're like, oh, I'm going to pass. And maybe they're only $10 a piece, and you still pass on something that you could probably do something great with. What we have, what I do, and this knowledge is handed down from, most of you will be able to guess the source. Back in the 80s, there's a magazine that was half devoted to just rebuilding this stuff. And they used to test this stuff all the time. Now, if I've got a good reflection on this, these little things here, these phosphor bronze round bearings, need to be filed flat. And that's it. And I promise you, if you do more, they will come out. Now, sometimes, if it's a particularly difficult model, and they get to be difficult when these frames get bent. If it gets dropped on the floor, side frames, which are all metal, can get bent. Then they're really hard to get them to stay on the track. So sometimes I will take a 64th out of this center hole. That's it, just a tiny bit, and it will give that center axle just a little bit of play. Now, I have already lubricated these gears with the red lithium grease, and they're going to go on these posts. What I've done, a lot of you have thought, well, you can replace the old sintered steel wheels with new, like nickel-plated wheels and stuff. I don't do that. I keep these. And the reason I keep them is they're porous. Porous metal has always been a weakness of these, and it's made them difficult to clean. They get dirty, and they lose contact, and all kinds of problems. But go to a lumber yard. For $5, you can get a tube of Oxguard. Take the Oxguard on a little paintbrush. Anything that makes electrical contact or might rust, you paint that on there. Thick grease at first. I go all the way around the wheels. Usually I'll paint the inside of this, then I'll polish it off, then I'll go ahead and I'll put the Oxguard on. Put that on there. Oxguard will turn to a film, a conductive film, and a soft film. So it conducts electricity and it's soft. So even when it turns to the film, it doesn't really inhibit the free rolling of these trucks. But what it does do is it makes a huge difference in electrical pickup. In fact, I have all my track coated with it. This track on this workbench here has not been cleaned in like 4 or 5 years, and it doesn't need it. It just doesn't. Once you've coated it, it stays clean. It stays conductive, regardless of whether or not it gets dirty. All right, so I probably should have put these gears in here first, but that doesn't really matter. They only go in one way, so don't be afraid to take them apart. Just like that. There's only one way to get it to go together. There we have it. Now this particular truck happens to be missing a rear clip. That's just the way it was when I got it. I'm going to 3D print one and just make one. I'm not going to go salvage one. I'm not going to go hunting around for them. It's so easy to 3D print parts these days. I printed all of these things just today. And it's just that easy. The trick to 3D printing them, one, you got to know your printer, how you make the prints. Two, you got to figure out how to make this, which is actually fits on here like that. Trick to designing these is to figure out what is it in the real world. Well, what it is, it's a cylinder. It's got a cutout of a cylinder on each side, and it's got a sphere in the middle. It's only a matter of using your calipers and a machinist ruler, a little trial and error, and you'll come up with something. I'll tell you one thing that does not work is you don't 3D print the hole that goes on the shaft. You can leave a tiny hole, But if you 3D print the hole, it will never, ever turn out. You leave a tiny indentation or put a 0.5 millimeter hole all the way through, and then you'll have a place where you can, it's basically like using an auto center punch to drill a hole. That's all there is to it. The best way to get the hole in here is to put it in a lathe. If you don't have a lathe, twist drill and take your time with it. Try to make it nice and straight. Because these are round, the filament will guide you towards, kind of towards the center. But with these joints, you don't have to be centered on this thing. It can be off and it won't matter. All right, let's put this guy together. Now we've got our wheels coated. We've got our bearings coated. We've coated all the parts that can rust. We've coated all the parts that might wear off and have corrosion. These side frames, they will corrode, and you will have some corrosion. We've painted everything that needs to be painted. Okay, we have lubed. I put the grease in the gears just enough. Okay, very nice. Okay, so now how do we know how to put this back together? Well, here's the thing. The rule is, track in front of me, this rail that is closest to me is going to be the red rail. The one that is farthest is the black rail. When the locomotive, whose front is designated by wherever the light bracket was, on this one it happens to be a knob. On the other one there's a platform. Got it sitting facing right on the rails. The tab that comes up should be towards you. And I have pre-soldered a red wire, but it's going to go like this. The side closest to you is the red side. When I put the arrow on the power pack and I give it some voltage, with the arrow pointed right, locomotive facing right, it needs to move to the right. I always make all my stuff red and black. Keep it that simple. That way everything I have matches. Here's my motor. I'm going to mount this motor. I do not use screw-in mounts. Everywhere I did put a screw-in one, I'm taking it out. To mount this motor, I printed basically a box with a little round cutout that I measured off of this motor. Nothing more. Simple. It's just a box. This is what I use. Goop. The reason I use goop is, one, I can change my mind. If I don't like this, I can change my mind and take it up. Two, it's flexible. Totally absorbs vibration. If you were using sticky tape down here, sticky tape is cushion, but it's not all that flexible. And once you stick to it, it's a little bit difficult to reposition without kind of ruining the stickiness of it. With this thing, I'm going to put this on here. I'm just going to glue it. I'm not even going to mill out the bottom here. Sometimes I made them all nice and flat, but I'm just going to put a little bit of glue on here, goop. And when it cures, it'll be just right. I can move it back and forth to make sure I've got my shafts the way I want them, and everything will work out exactly as I want. What I don't want to do is to be doing things that require such a severe tolerance that there's no room for error. I want a lot of room for error. And the reason I want a lot of room for error, it makes it run smoother with nice tolerances. The way we've done this by smoothing out those bearings should run over some pretty rough track. If it's not, if for some reason these side frames aren't square, then we can take, like I said, just a tiny bit out of the middle, and that'll help square it. That'll help it negotiate rougher track. But as we have it right now, just that little bit of red lithium, and the red lithium will spread amongst the teeth, and then that's where it'll stay. Any excess will catch in one spot, and you can wipe it out, and that'll be the end of it. You'll never have to worry about it again. So here's my motor. This is the way I have it set up. I have the power leads on this one. They're going to be facing forward. Does it really matter? No. On the, I guess that one's facing forward. That one's facing forward. This one's facing one way and one's facing the other way. These motors, if you got more room, or let's say you had a detailed cab and you don't want these wires running through there, you can switch it around. And you can put it in, you can mount it a different way. There's no problem with that. But let's take a look again at the wires. All right. Those of you who know me, there are two things I tell you never to use. One is this copper shaft on your moto tool. Do not use it. It will rip stuff apart. Two, told you never to use this acid paste. It's not for you. Here is the exception right now. Those of you who build fast tracks and who've taken the time to watch the soldering instruction video know, what do they tell you to do? If you've ever built fast track switches, when you switched over to acid paste, it worked a lot better, didn't it? And it stayed together. When you used the rosin paste and built your switches and you got them on your layout, rails broke free. But when you switched to acid, they didn't. Just like the fast tracks guys say in the instruction video, the acid is for a mechanical joint. If you need mechanical strength, you need to use the acid, and we are soldering to steel. We need to use the steel brush to clean that steel and then put the acid on it to make sure that we can tin the spot where we want to attach the wire. Doing all that, that being said, there will be corrosion. You can clean it off in a couple ways. Simple way is wipe it off with acetone and then paint over it with the boxcars. That works great. I haven't had any flash rust issues or any corrosive issues from doing that. Anytime you need a mechanical joint, acid paste, but you have to clean it when you're done. When you're polishing metal, the copper shaft indicates the steel brush, and the steel brush will rip things apart. If you don't have those replacement parts, use the silver shaft. All right. So I've got it all wired. It's going to attach on, and it is going to look like that. Everything is cleaned. This is what we're going to end up with. And there it is. I painted these things so that they don't corrode. And I made a little PC board on top. What I've got here, I'll show you a blank one. Let's see here. Okay, here's a blank one. And then I've got a whole pile of them here that I've tinned. I take a little piece of PC board, I cut a strip down the middle and cut it off. I glue it onto the top here. I bring all the contact wires to the PC board, then I connect the motor to the PC board. That's how I do it on everything. So I get, even on this, here's one all set up. Red on the right, black on the left. That's how I get it set up. And that's how now if I want to wire a decoder in, all I need to do is disconnect the two motor leads, get the power from the PC board to my decoder to the motor, and we're done. All right, let's try it, and then you guys can ask some questions if you got any. Okay, so this is our there she is. You can see a little bouncing up and down here, but you don't hear anything. Very nice. That's all there is to it. In the next, since this is the last of these motors, I'm going to have to find whatever the new replacement for the double shaft motor is. I'm hoping it's one of these Mabuchis. Haven't found a double shaft version of it yet, but that's what I'm hoping to get out of that. Okay, now you guys can tell me, what do you want to see? If you want to see something, chances are I have it. Or if
Matt,
they're... Go ahead.
can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, we have a little homework task for you.
Okay.
Your video feed kind of stopped working. We saw a picture every 10 seconds. So the homework would be if you could videotape this for us, and then we would replace the whole video when we upload it to YouTube.
Oh, actually, I already have. Take any one of these you want off of my YouTube channel.
Okay. So let's go to some questions. Why the 24-volt motor instead of a 12-volt motor?
That's the question I was hoping you were going to ask. Okay. Why the 24 volts instead of the 12 volts? Here's a 24-volt motor. Now, do we have a video feed where you can actually see me?
No, just explain it to us.
Okay. 24 volts. A standard Tech 2 power pack, the one that's connected to this workbench, puts out 14.43 volts. If the maximum revolutions of this motor at 24 volts is, say, 20,000, at 12 volts, it is only 10,000, which is more than fast enough to run a locomotive. So what you have is you have about 50% safety built in with a 24-volt motor. You will never, in any railroad application, you are not going to reach 24 volts or go over the 24 volts that it's rated at. So you've got 50% extra headroom and safety built in. The 24-volt motor also has a tremendous amount, much more torque than a 12-volt motor. Like I said, you can tear off the joints out of the, you can tear the joints out of the locomotive and the motor will stay spinning rather than have your motor stall. That's why I use 24-volt motors. The other thing is, at the low end, they have significantly greater control. And I got to operate on a layout that ran DCC and momentum. And that's what really got me interested in using 24-volt motors, because at half a volt, the motor will turn, and the motor has enough torque that it will turn and move the locomotive at half a volt. The response range is perfect for momentum. Notice I don't use any flywheels. You don't use flywheels with 24-volt motors. You don't need them. In fact, they're actually a hindrance. All they do is introduce vibrations that you don't need. That answered?
Yes. Next question. Do you have a source for the screwdriver motors?
Like I said, this is it. There are no more of these. They've been replaced. The next best thing, Mabuchi motors, 6 poles, and Johnson motors. Now, the places you get these, sometimes you can get them at your local auto parts store. This Johnson motor right here happens to be a rear view mirror motor on some cars, but it's only got 1 pole on it. I haven't got a new good source of super strong double shaft motors yet, but I'll have one soon.
Are those the same rare earth motors that you're talking about?
No, the rare earth motor, well, if you can't see, the rare earth motors are the ones that can lift up the giant bolt. They can pull it off the table, in fact, connected to each other. I don't know if you can see that.
Not yet.
I'll just hold it here for a second. The brand new motors don't do this at all and are much more powerful than this. They are a lot more powerful than this. And they don't even hardly stick to anything. Hopefully you'll be able to see that.
Someone mentioned they use a new lube on their motors. Have you ever heard of that?
I use only red lithium. I have tried everything, but this stuff definitely this Mag 1 lube won me over when I had a box of 70 locomotives that I had to keep out in my storage garage for a while that I didn't feel like breaking open, and there was absolutely no damage or deterioration in any of the lubed parts. That was one we just opened up.
Okay. 2 more questions.
Okay.
You mentioned you're 3D printing some parts. Someone asked if they could get access to the STL files for those.
Sure. What part do you want? Motor mount is nothing but a box. You go into Tinkercad and make a box of the dimension you want, and you come out. Shafts and couplings, they're nothing more than cylinders with a cutout.
Correct.
So I just measure them with a caliper, and then that's what I put in my modeling program, and then I print them.
And the last question is, how do people get to your YouTube channel?
My YouTube channel is Elite194.
Elite194.
Yes, and you can see everything I've done here. I do in depth in building this DD40 is probably a 10-part series. Doing this U30C that we've been looking at just now, that's in there. Pretty much every locomotive that Athearn makes, I've got in there.
Well, thank you very much. We told each other to listen to you like we were listening to radio way back then.
Okay.
So we'll find the YouTube video.
It looks good from my end, but
yeah. So thank you for your time. And
all right. Well, thanks for having me.
Pleasure.
And I'll see you on Thursday night, and we'll see if we can't get the video straightened out because we're going to paint.
Yes, please.
We are going to paint that brass locomotive. Oh, you can't see it, or I would show it to you. We're going to paint that brass locomotive. We're going to paint the Kraus Mafia ML4000, and by popular demand, we're going to do a GP9. Probably going to do 2 of them, maybe even 3 of them. But we're going to do them all at the same time in 1 hour.
Wow.
With a paintbrush, by the way. We're going to use a paintbrush.
Thank you, sir.
All right.
Hi there, I believe we're live again. I'm Speed, outside the Helix tonight, and our next presenter, after he verified that New Zealand has never lost to Scotland in cricket,
And
worked in
rugby,
the broadcast.
rugby.
Rugby? Yeah, but Corey is a cricket fan. We should look up the cricket scores.
We don't do so well there.
The next clinician worked in broadcast radio, in the airlines, in electronic sales, then at a museum helping people with their military history. So welcome from actually tomorrow in Auckland, New Zealand, Mr. Paul Hobbs.
Thank you. Today we're talking about Streamline passenger trains serving St. Louis. We're going to discuss all these topics right here. And I needed to include the Gateway Arch. Now, I could have taken, well, I did take pictures of the arch itself, but it seemed more romantic, I guess, to use the shadow of the arch. And the top of the shadow is actually pointing to Market Street, which is the street entrance to St. Louis Union Station, a few blocks away from here. Here is the station itself. It's a stub-in 32-track terminal and may be the largest station in the United States. I didn't check that particular detail. All passenger trains who arrive here back into the station, so the smoky end of the train stays closer to the entrance of the train shed. And there's only one railroad that came to St. Louis that operated in both directions. In other words, into St. Louis and then out of St. Louis. And even then, they didn't operate the one train through. So a lot of sleeping cars were switched from one railroad to another at the station, as we will see further on. And if you really want a modeling exercise, try 47 slip switches. And in 1947, the daily average of trains was 288 per day arriving and departing. That is about one movement every 5 minutes. The red circle, which you'll see quite a few of highlighting where St. Louis is currently highlighting where the station is. I've also mentioned Wabash Delmar Station, which is on Delmar Boulevard. 2 Union Station from the east would come over the Merchants Bridge, then over the TRRA tracks and down in through Delmar and come in from the west. Here's the station itself, a rather attractive building, and a couple of pictures below of Missouri Pacific and Wabash locomotives. There's also a hotel in the station. In fact, even today, there's a hotel in what was St. Louis Union Station. A 1920s postcard. Postcards were quite often airplane view, which of course was a novelty in the 1920s. It's a bit fuzzy, but it's essentially the same depot that's right there today. So it's been around a very long time. 2 years ago, I gave a talk at Kansas City Convention about passenger trains serving Kansas City, which led to developing this one as well. It's interesting to compare those two stations in that Kansas City was a through station with 16 tracks. St. Louis is a stub-in terminal with 32 tracks. In Kansas City, many of the trains passed through, whereas every train that came to St. Louis terminated here. And at Kansas City, no East Coast Railroad, as in one that touched the East Coast, reached Kansas City, and yet at St. Louis, only less than 300 miles away, no Western Railroad actually came to St. Louis. One dominant railroad in Kansas City with a lot of other railroads, whereas St. Louis was many railroads with moderate amounts of traffic. Kansas City was on the major route to California. St. Louis was not, but it was on the major route to Texas, as we'll see. The Terminal Railroad Association of St. Louis was owned by all of the railroads that came to St. Louis, and apparently is the largest freight and passenger terminal operation in the world. As you can see down there, there's a large variety of switching locomotives that were operated, mostly EMD, but every other manufacturer was represented with a few locomotives. The TRRA did not operate any passenger trains of its own. Here's a couple of examples. The SW1 is hauling some Norfolk and Western cars, so that's after 1964. And then below, the earlier paint scheme was grey, hauling a couple of Pennsylvania P70 coaches. 15 major railroads came into St. Louis, and I've listed the successes off to the right, up to and including Conrail. I have not bothered with the split that was after Conrail. Even in the time frame we're talking about, the Southern Railway, as we'll see, didn't have passenger service into St. Louis. Back in 1910, I did some comparisons of the number of railroads serving various cities. Of course, Chicago came out on top with 33, but St. Louis was up there with 22, not far behind New York. So a lot of railroads came to St. Louis. Let's have a look at some of the named trains that came to St. Louis. From the west, we have the city of St. Louis, which was primarily a UP train, followed by several other trains to Kansas City, Omaha, and the Missouri Pacific to Denver. To the east, all these trains on 3 railroads went to New York, or Pittsburgh, or Cleveland. And to the north, 10 trains a day at one time operated between St. Louis and Chicago on 3 railroads. Most of them operated a morning train, a midday train, and a night train. And again to the north, the Wabash had a couple of trains to Detroit, and the Burlington went to Minneapolis along with the Rock Island, and the Burlington also had a train that went to Burlington, Illinois, I believe. To the south, the Frisco operated several trains towards Texas and Memphis, and the Missouri Pacific down to Texas. And the L&N, from time to time, ran the Hummingbird to Nashville. Let's have a look at a number of ads which featured passenger trains that served St. Louis. Both the Burlington and the Rock Island feature the Zephyr Rocket, which was a joint train which went between St. Louis and Minneapolis. Here's an early one from the Missouri Pacific featuring the Scenic Limited. The Scenic Limited was the predecessor to the California Zephyr. Union Pacific pushing a train to California. Burlington was showing both Chicago and St. Louis going towards Denver. Baltimore and Ohio had an outpost route that came into St. Louis. Another Baltimore and Ohio ad. Then you have the Louisville and Nashville, which primarily ran from St. Louis to Evansville with connections to mainline trains that went out of there. Union Pacific again with the city of St. Louis, fairly early ad in 1947. And then you've got the all-diesel powered Pennsylvania. That's 12 long-distance passenger trains operated by the Pennsylvania. Starts off with the Broadway Limited, which of course was their flagship train, but the Spirit of St. Louis is right there behind it. And you've got the Texas Eagle, which they operated with the Missouri Pacific, and a couple of other trains that came to St. Louis. The E units using the Wabash train. Colorado Eagle after they'd introduced dome cars. This one in 1957 is an early color ad in the National Geographic, and of course that's also promoting dome cars, which Union Pacific at that time called Astrodomes, and another B&O ad for the National Limited. One was rather nice about Missouri Pacific introducing the dieselized Eagles. This was just starting daily service, which would have been about 1947. Come on, here we go. That particular ad, also relatively inexpensive in its day. Let's move on to some sleeping cars. In 1952, in a book called Night Trains by Peter, sleeping cars out of St. Louis. Now, it wasn't very long before a lot of these dropped off, especially the short haul trips. St. Louis was on the through route for trains going to Texas. It was not on any coast-to-coast sleeper service which mostly went through Omaha and Kansas City. So the GM&O had a couple of connecting cars that went to Texas on the Missouri Pacific. The Pennsylvania Railroad connected to all these other places, except for the Frisco trip, which we'll talk about when we get to that train. The slumber coach on the B&O, that was a car that was introduced by Bud around 1956, and the B&O and the Missouri Pacific owned a few. When the through cars stopped running, and all those slumber coaches ended up being bought by the Northern Pacific. This map on the Pennsylvania timetable in 1954 gives a good idea of the way the cars were routed, and here's another of my little circles around St. Louis so that you know where it is fairly quickly. You'll see at St. Louis they diverge off onto Frisco and Missouri Pacific to different places. At the bottom, there are a couple of models. One on the bottom left is a brass model. The one on the bottom right is a Walthers model. They are demonstrating that the Pennsylvania Railroad owned cars that were in the color scheme of the connecting railroad. And so you've got Pennsylvania on the headboard or the letterboard of the Frisco car, and a very discreet PRR at each end of the Missouri Pacific car, which has got the Eagle name in the middle, and it's one of the rare railroads that put the train name in the letterboard instead of the railroad name. We're going to go through the various railroads who served St. Louis and see what kind of service they provided and how many trains they ran. The biggest was the Wabash, with 9 trains a day at a particular time. And what I'm doing is using one demonstration timetable somewhere in the late 40s to mid 60s to demonstrate the kind of service they ran. Between Chicago and St. Louis, they ran 3 trains a day. Each one had a different type of car consist, because the day trains didn't need sleepers, and of course the overnight ones did. They featured dome liner on the Bluebird. That was the feature train of the day. Going across to Kansas City, there were 3 trains a day, one of which was the city of St. Louis with the Union Pacific, city of Kansas City, which they ran on their own, and then the Midnight Limited, which had sleeping cars. And then to Detroit, there were 2 trains a day, and again, one carried chair cars and the other carried sleepers. So each one had distinctive look because of the types of equipment it had. If you look at the sleeping cars on the Detroit Limited, one of them is a 12-roomette 4 double bedroom, and the other is a 664. Let me find my glasses. Oh, there they are. The other one is a 6-bedroom buffet lounge. And what I've discovered with these ones with a lot of roomettes is that they tended to be businessman trains, because a lot of sales representatives, etc., would travel on their own, whereas the ones with a lot of double bedrooms tended to be more towards family movement. And here we have a train to Omaha, and westbound it was called the Omaha Limited, and eastbound it was called the St. Louis Limited, with one 664 sleeper. Rather pretty locomotive. R.H. Foss has done a rather nice effort of colorizing black and white photographs, and I've stolen a couple of examples off the web. Down below is the more simplified paint scheme, which I got at a Trains magazine. Here's Wabash locomotives hauling Union Pacific equipment, which of course is the city of St. Louis. And then you've got the city of Kansas City departing further below. We're mentioning Union Pacific simply because of the connection. Union Pacific did not come to St. Louis in its own right, and I do not believe that their locomotives ever came on to St. Louis. So another crop circle, and it's nearly 300 miles from Kansas City to St. Louis, and the Wabash participated in that part of the business. And they also contributed cars for equalization purposes to the Union Pacific trains, so you're going to see Wabash letterboards on Army yellow cars. I will use a few examples of passenger train consists from Wayner books. And here is a typical one in 1959 with 3 E units, 3 head-end cars, several coaches, one of them a dome, and a dome buffet lounge. They were all the domes were introduced about 1957. Some of those sleepers would have come from St. Louis, and 1 or 2 of them would have been added at Kansas City. Union Pacific had some PAs, but they were mostly an EMD E unit operation. Consists of the city of St. Louis changed over time, and also we need to point out that passenger cars operated in a very distinct order. And so you've got vestibule rear and vestibule forward to show which way round the car is in that particular train. And by 1968, the train wasn't even coming to St. Louis. By now it's called the city of Kansas City. But that's showing in 1 decade a drastic drop in the business between, or just for that one train came along, and primarily they ran just the one train going up to Minneapolis. Here's a schedule here. The Zephyr rocket was a joint operation with the Rock Island, and it ran partway up on the Burlington, connecting to the Rock Island at Burlington and continuing on to Minneapolis. Each railroad provided 1 train set. Western railroads quite often provided connections at terminals information in their timetables. Eastern railroads like the New York Central and the Pennsylvania Railroad and the B&O, I've never found that kind of information. So here's a chance to see the overview of trains at St. Louis. And for Burlington, very little of these other railroads were competitors, so they were quite happy to show most of them in their timetable. And at this time, there are about 110 arrivals and departures per day. And that is about half what we were talking about when the situation was shown for the teens or 1920s. The first, and they also went to Dallas with the MKT. Here's an example from 1959. The St. Louis, Oklahoma train was called the Meteor, and by this time, equipment went off towards Dallas and also connected up with another train that came from Kansas City. And I found a blotter online, which was rather nice for an ad that showed the Meteor, the Texas Special, etc., etc. Finding timetables for the Katy was rather a mission, but Streamline and Memories was an excellent source for timetables. I had this one for 1938, which is a bit outside our time framing, but at least it shows which was the incentive to have the Texas Special, because the Frisco had a more direct route from St. Louis towards Texas. And here is the Texas Special at that time. And the interesting thing about the way the Katy worked is they split trains around Denison, Texas, so that one train would go to Dallas and another one would go to Fort Worth, and then continue on to either San Antonio or Houston. Examples of Katy trains. Even in the Streamline era, there were a large number of heavyweight cars at the head ends of the passenger trains. And to the left is the discontinuation by Katy of the other trains from St. Louis, just favoring the Texas Special. The Texas Special was the fastest service between Dallas and New York financial centers, Dallas being a financial center in the oil business, and New York a financial center for much of the other stuff except what's in Chicago. The GM&O is a favored line towards Chicago and had the most trains per day. Again, you have a night train, a day train, and on this occasion, you've got a 10-6 that connected from the Abraham Lincoln to Hot Springs onto the Mopac train, and then going back again on the right-hand side. So some of those will get highlighted as we're going through various trains. They were the most frequent service to Chicago. They used both E units and PAs. And here's another colorized picture from Mr. Foss. Interesting colored equipment. Missouri Pacific, another hometown railroad, route of the Eagles. They had 2 trains specifically to Kansas City, and then 1 train each to Denver and Omaha via Kansas City. Using the 1960 timetable, we can show these connections. Now they have some competitors, so they don't show those, but by this time, just 9 years after the Burlington example, we're down to 58 a row. 4 trains a day between St. Louis and Kansas City, and their main westbound train, the Colorado Eagle, had sleeping cars and thrifty sleepers, which was their version of a slumber coach. Trains down to Texas. Notice they optimistically want you to connect at El Paso onto the Southern Pacific, but if you look at some of those connections, you're waiting around for quite a long time. Chicago to Hot Springs car on the GM&O, so that's the opposite end of what we saw before. And on the Texas Eagle, we've got 1, 2, 3 cars which came from north on the GM&O and the east on the Pennsylvania and the B&O. The publicity photo shows a blue and white paint scheme. Later on, they simplified it to just blue, as in the example below. See, there's at least a couple of dome cars on that train. And the Missouri River Eagle, 1971, is a 3-car train leaving Kansas City. And the Colorado Eagle is backing into St. Louis Union Station. That's an early picture because of the color scheme. More examples of consists. Colorado Eagle with 2 E units, a 14-roomette Dada sleeping car, and 2 other sleeping cars, a diner, a dome coach. But the Missouri River Eagle is interesting in that look at all the head-end cars that are on it, including one from New York Central, another one from the Pennsylvania, and several Railway Express agency cars. 1963, simplified paint scheme, just about to depart, and a GM&O train off in the distance. Rock Island. Rock Island had its own line from Kansas City, but by the time of the Streamline trains, it was freight only. But they did participate with the Burlington going up to Minneapolis, and again, connection there was at Burlington. Here's the timetable showing in the Rock Island timetable, and at Burlington you can clearly see that the latter part of the run is on the queue. Nearly 600-mile run. The lower picture is a black and white shot with an E6 locomotive of the Zephyr rocket. Rather fuzzy picture, but anyway, probably silver cars. Illinois Central had 3 trains a day going to Chicago, and they also had people that would connect to their trains down to New Orleans. I forget exactly where, probably Springfield. Here's an E unit leaving from St. Louis Union Station. The L&N, again an outpost of operations for them. There were 2 periods when the Georgian ran to Atlanta from St. Louis in 1948, and then the last few years before Amtrak started. but most of the time they ran 3 daily trains to Evansville, connecting with the name trains. Example there, they call it the Hummingbird and the Georgian, but it's connecting to 2 different trains. By this time in 1965, just 1 train a day. New York Central, again, a beeline straight from Indianapolis to St. Louis so that they get into that freight connection with the Western railroads by avoiding Chicago. At one point, they had 5 trains a day. Southwestern Limited was the premier train. New York Central did not provide any through service with other railroads. They provided red cap service that was specified in their timetables so that you could get from the NYC train to the Frisco and Mopac connecting trains. And even with their connection that they did with the California Zephyr, they provided their own car rather than being like the Pennsylvania did, providing a CZ-looking car. Southwestern Limited, pinstripe colors in the 1950s, and then the cigar band by about 1965. Pennsylvania, again coming from Indianapolis, probably had frequent races with the New York Central, which they often did, particularly out of Elkhart. Another 5 trains a day. The Spirit of St. Louis came New York to St. Louis with connecting car or through cars from Washington. By 1954, section cars were becoming somewhat obsolete, but they did have a number of betterment cars that were put into this train. One of the reasons for continuing to have sections was that when the government paid for their people to travel by train, they paid for a lower berth. So if you had sections, that's what you would accommodate the passenger with. If you did not have any sections, you had to provide them a roomette, which was higher priced accommodation on the Mopac and the Frisco. BP-20s, interesting locomotive, which was only ever operated by the Pennsylvania, that did come to St. Louis on the Spirit of St. Louis. Penn, Texas coming in. And you can tell it's deriving because it's going to come past the depot and then back in. The caption for the top one, because a lot of these captions are exactly from where I stole the picture from. This originally said it was departing, but at this position, it is actually backing into the depot, and a Missouri Pacific train is coming out. Here's a Frisco car in a Pennsy consist. There would be a Pennsylvania one with their own letterboard every 3rd or 4th day. Baltimore and Ohio, a beeline from Cincinnati. The National Limited was the class train, followed by the Diplomat, coming from New York and Baltimore and Washington. Rather nice paint scheme. They rebuilt a number of heavyweight cars to look stream styled, and this baggage dormitory is an example of that. And in 1932, the National Limited was the first long distance train to be fully air conditioned. Sometimes the early air conditioning efforts were sleepers, followed by coaches, followed by diners. Nickel plate came in once a day from Cleveland, and they operated. The only sleeping car they had was a 10-6, and they had 13 of them for the various trains that they ran. The Cotton Belt. While I found this on the web for the cover and the map, I couldn't get any further from this particular resource as to content, so I happen to have a 1951 official guide of the railways. It's rather fragile, but I scanned this the other day, and there was one train in 1951 each way from there to Dallas, and all of that train at that time was still heavyweight. Cotton Belt did have pretty trains in daylight colors, but probably not on this particular run. This one. In 1968, Penn Central was formed, and here is a timetable from that operation. 3 trains a day came to St. Louis. They were all former Pennsylvania trains, so the New York Central one had been eliminated. Notice there are no through cars to anywhere. In 1971, Amtrak came into existence, and initially that ran the schedules you'll see in a moment. Today, Amtrak has 5 trains a day from Chicago, 1 from San Antonio, and 2 trains from Kansas City. So it's considerable growth from what they started with, which was 1 train that went from New York via St. Louis to Kansas City, and then 2 trains from Chicago. And that was it. We're going to go through a few pictures just to show you how pretty the trains were that came to St. Louis. Nickel plate with their PAs, that was their only passenger power. New York Central with PAs and E's. Pennsylvania with their nice Tuscan red, their BP20s in the green or black. PAs as well. Wabash had PAs and E's. I think I missed one. Nope, here we go. Wabash E unit. I think that is in, looks like the St. Louis area. B&O with their blue, that's a fairly late color scheme. New York Central Cigar Band on the Knickerbocker, which was one of the trains out of New York. And GM&O just before Amtrak started. Panama Limited, well, they'd be a connecting train by then. It's got a Jeep instead of E units. And this Missouri Pacific train has a whole 2 cars. The Frisco was the only railroad to operate locomotives which had the name of the train emblazoned on the locomotives. Texas Special. This is, whoop. Go to the passenger cars. Here's an example of a slumber coach. The idea behind the slumber coach was to provide a sleeping room on a coach ticket. And by the design of this particular car, you were able to get 40 people into it versus a 10-6, which had 22. And 40 people in sleeping accommodations is not much less than a long-distance coach, which usually had 44 to 48 passengers. Illinois Central, on the other hand, you see dome cars in Illinois Central colors, yet they never owned any. They rented cars from other railroads in the winter season and painted them Illinois Central, then gave them back. And I know from the Northern Pacific examples, they would usually get one that's needing repainting anyway and get it back and repaint it in the proper colors. Texas Special, round end observation. L&N, blue cars. Union Pacific, yellow cars. And Wabash blue on stainless steel. Pennsylvania Tuscan, attractive GM&O colors. Is an Eagle car, which it has the owner at each end, so it would say MP for the majority of the cars from Missouri Pacific. New York Central two-tone gray, and we have reached the end, and I'm a bit early.
You mind going back one slide?
One slide. Yes.
One slide. I noticed there's some blue and red in the same train. And even the one at the top right, those 2 cars might not be the same color either.
I don't think they are. I can't answer the question.
So did they?
It could very well be.
Colors?
Sorry?
No, go ahead.
It could very well be that it was after Amtrak came along and they're either in storage or excursion service. So
Okay.
There's no mention of dates on those particular pictures. How did we do?
Good. You have at least 100 people awake.
Oh,
Have you done any research on the mail and baggage portions of the passenger trains?
no. There would have been huge amounts of mail coming in and out of St. Louis, so I would think there'd be a large terminal annex there for mail, and I'm sure Railway Express Agency had a large operation there too for train shipments. And as you saw with the Missouri Pacific train, through cars.
Yes. Do you have any idea what it cost to ride the train back then, 1960, 1962?
I don't have the
Is it
answer, but if you look at those Streamline and Memories timetables that I stole, generally at the back end of those, they quite often have sample fares,
okay?
both coach and sleeper.
And then we know that Amtrak took it over at some
Yes.
point. Would it be
Well, May
what would the
1st,
profit?
1971.
Correct. What would the profitability be in between now and way back then? Did it
Well,
cost more to run passenger trains, or
I don't know. I don't think passenger trains ever were a profit maker from the point of view of oh, we're going to make big bucks out of it. It's more of a service. And when that service was no longer required, they quickly eliminated it. You know? Why would you take a train all the way from New York to Dallas if you can fly there in 4 hours?
correct? Do you know how many trains went east and how many went west? How many trains east and then to the west?
A small number went west. So really you only had the Colorado Eagle for the Missouri Pacific, which went to Denver via Pueblo. And you had the Union Pacific train, which it had connections. Well, you could take a through car all the way to Portland or Seattle sometimes on the Union Pacific.
And do you have any idea of how many passengers went through St. Louis each day?
A lot. I would think in World War II that place would have been gangbusters. And the fact that every train terminates there, everybody has to get off and everybody has to get on. Whereas if you compare that with Kansas City, all those trains on the Santa Fe and the Rock Island, a fair proportion of the passengers were on it when it arrived and still on it when it left. So there'd be a lot less servicing of passengers at Kansas City.
And a lot more foot traffic in St. Louis.
Yes.
So someone noticed that you had the timetable there going south from Chicago. Do you know if Bloomington, Normal, Illinois was a stop south of that?
I don't know. It sounds like it would have been Illinois Central. Another thing to remember, which I haven't featured here at all, is the large interurban network. An Illinois Terminal was one of them, which pervade for Illinois and Indiana. And so a lot of people wouldn't use the railroad, they would use the interurban. And you don't see suburban or local trains out of either Kansas City or St. Louis in the streamlined era.
Pam mentioned that about 100,000 people a day during World War II.
That's pretty good.
Tom wants to know if the California Zephyr went all the way to, or did it go into St. Louis?
No, it was a Chicago, Omaha, Denver train.
Okay. And that is the end of the questions. There's still a few more coming in. I see people typing.
Well, we've got some time.
Yeah. Come on, guys. Bring on those questions. Type faster.
Nice that were enough people interested.
Yeah.
I did see someone comment that there were very few St. Louis topics in this particular sequence. So
we cannot say that we didn't try.
Well, certainly Brad Joseph tried to get us all involved. So I don't know how many from the convention actually participate.
What did you say the two Allen N trains were again?
Hummingbird and the Georgian. Georgian, yeah. Going to Atlanta.
I believe he is correct. The IC was a route south from Bloomington Normal. This guy knows his railroads. I, I could have
Well,
told you that.
the Illinois Central basically went straight south from Chicago to New Orleans. So
And is the Zephyr still doesn't go through St. Louis.
no, but back in the heavyweight days, the Scenic Limited, that was a Mopac connection. So that really wasn't sort of promoted very much in the California Zephyr days.
So if you were to go from St. Louis to Kansas City,
Yes,
which train would you take, or how many trains would you have a day that you could choose from?
there were 3 Wabash and 4 Mopac. And when you consider the Rock Island also took that route but didn't run passenger trains, the Burlington took that route and also didn't take passenger trains. And really, those 2 railroads dominated that business.
Oh wow! Here's another
So there's
question.
a question just come in then, Speed.
Yeah.
Dave has asked, what year did the station was last used as train service? He believes it's now used as a mall.
It was fairly shortly after Amtrak started. So I would think around the early to mid 70s. And I remember using the station that they did put together, and it was basically a series of containers, rather rudimentary operation there. It's a lot better now at Gateway Station, I believe. Don't have a chance to do that, do we, this year?
And you said there's
No.
still a hotel in there?
Yes.
Okay.
I could look it up and tell you the brand if you like.
Please.
Okay.
We might get some more questions.
Yeah, Pam's just put in the chat there, the final passenger train departed on October 31, 1978 at 11:38 p.m.
Brad, were you
Maybe she
born yet?
needs to do a clinic.
Speed, I was still a twinkle.
Paul, we're working on her. We're begging.
What sort of topics does she like to do?
Pam, tell us. She is magic behind the scenes here with the computer. You just mention a website and she has it already typed in, verified and double checked.
The St. Louis Union Station Hotel Curiosity Shop. Drury Inn in St. Louis at Union Station. So it's a Drury Inn.
Okay.
But it doesn't seem to be in the same location as the original station, which was in the head house. Like the terminal hotel was in that head house. And that mall is called St. Louis Union Station Carousel.
So did you perhaps by any chance rode a train into St. Louis?
Me?
Yes.
I rode a train out, but not in.
Okay.
I went there one time with, at the last St. Louis convention in 2001. Some friends from Portland, Oregon area and I shared a train up to Chicago, and I was taking the Builder and they were taking the Zephyr out of Chicago, and we had several hours, so they knew to take us on a river cruise. The architectural river cruise in Chicago is a must-do.
I can imagine.
Run out of questions? Or have we got the title of Pam's Clinic?
Pam's just put in there, it's a secret. So
It's a railroad secret.
I remember a magazine editor trying to come up with a clinic that had zero contact. I figured he got close a couple of times. I'm not going to tell you which editor.
The Drury is across the street in what was the Railroad YMCA.
Oh, okay. Is this your expert again?
No. The expert said it's a collection by Hilton Property.
Okay.
Well, Paul, that was excellent.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
That was really, really nice. I learned a lot.
Was that
And,
the idea?
Maybe.
Well, I think that's also the reason why we lack so many questions. We've had so many good clinics with so much information packed into them that
Yeah.
no one has any questions left. They've
You've
all
had a
been
good,
answered.
you've had a good selection today, and I always like Dave Berman's talks.
Yeah, so I guess that's going to close us out for day 3 and lead us into day 4. But I'll throw a quick slide up once we're finished here of all the events for tomorrow that everyone can check out, and there'll be definitely some new stuff on there and stuff to look forward to. So, you got anything else to add there, Speed?
Goodbye, everybody, and thank you for staying with us. And thank you, Paul, for awesome clinic.
Very welcome. Thank you. Have fun. Look forward to tomorrow. I can just watch.